Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a chat about a topic I inadvertently raised a couple days ago, and a couple of you chimed in and said, yes, talk about it, and who am I to refuse? The topic was artists who knew when to quit. It so rarely happened. And so I thought about it. I thought about it for the past couple of days. Who were the ones who really knew when to quit? That is, who quit when they were still in their prime, before they deteriorated, before people had to start making excuses for the decrepitude. The nominal discussion of decrepitude arose in connection with late recordings by Claudio Abbado, with somebody who said, well, he had cancer, he was very ill, we have to make allowance for his physical condition. And my argument was, no, we don't. We shouldn't. We shouldn't. We should only insist that these people always give 100%. If they don't, we have to say so. We have to say sorry. I mean, maybe he was trying, but it's just not that good, or it wasn't as good as his other stuff. And that's just, for me, the reality. And as a critic, quite frankly, you can make whatever allowance you want as a listener, but as a critic, there's no excuse for it. None whatsoever. It's not for me to say that my listeners are supposed to feel sorry for somebody and so spend money on a disc of subpar performances. That's a decision that I can't possibly make for someone or even recommend that they make. My job is to say, what's the best version of work X if it's on a recording? Or can you do better? And if he was sick, well, too bad for him. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry he was sick. I know he suffered terribly. It was very sad. But the fact that that may have had an impact on his art, well, that's another issue. And so that grew into this question of, when is it the right time for artists to retire, and why do so few of them do it? Oh my goodness, so few of them do it. So I want to talk about a couple classes of performers where we can actually talk about some who they got when the getting was good. They left at the right time. Interestingly, the group about whom I think we could probably say there are the most of them, and I'm not in any way comprehensive. You may have some names too, many more than I'll come up with, because I want to keep this to a reasonable length, is singers. Because the deterioration of one's vocal apparatus is incredibly obvious, and there is no way to hide it. It just is what it is. Other, instrumentalists, and we're really only talking about like pianists and violinists, they can get away with it for longer. They can choose their repertoire a little bit more carefully, but the sound of a voice is the sound of a voice, and when it changes, you hear it like that, And that really is what happens. But here's the fascinating thing. I have a list here of 5 singers, and they are all women. I can't think of a single guy who had such high standards that he decided to leave before his voice caved in. Women are, it's so often the case in life, never mind the arts, there is a double standard where women are concerned. First of all, women singers are more important than men singers. Generally, that's also a double standard, one that favors the women. Sopranos are the big singers. Sopranos and mezzos, those are the big diva roles. The diva, the whole operatic world built around the concept of the prima donna. It's all about the female roles. The men, yes, they're important. Wagner had Helden tenors, and Handel had his castrati, but the truth of the matter is, you're there for the ladies, because the soprano voice, the female voice, is simply the most plangent, the most expressive, the most emotionally intense, the loudest, all of those things. And so we are merciless when it comes to the way we treat our female singers. We really are. The operatic world is so vicious, and they have such a good time being vicious. It's really kind of scary. It really is. But anyway, all of the singers that I could think of who left when it was the right time to go are female, whether it's because they had very high standards or because they were afraid of getting trashed as their vocal apparatus started to wear thin. I can't say. But I believe it was because they had integrity, because I knew some of these people, and boy, did they have integrity. A couple of them anyway. So let's talk about who they are, who's on the list of Female singers that knew when to quit. Well, one of the most obvious in recent memory is Janet Baker. Janet Baker wrote a whole book about it, her last year, singing, and her decision to retire while she still was in her prime and could uphold the standards that she was absolutely, it was invariable that she would uphold those standards. I mean, she was not going to compromise when it came to those artistic matters. She had a magnificent voice. She was an artist of incredible intelligence and beautiful technique, and she sang until she felt it was going to slip, and then she simply stopped. And that takes such courage and so much integrity. And she retired. Now she teaches, I guess, and does master classes. I've seen interviews with her. There are quite a few on YouTube, actually. And you do get a sense that of why she was known as Dame Granite, because she had that firmness of conviction in everything that she did. She really did. She was a no-nonsense artist. And I respect her enormously. Everybody respects her enormously. You can't not respect her. I mean, she's amazing. So that was one. The other was Ellie Ameling, the great Dutch singer, who also probably never made a bad record. But Ameling did not make a lot of opera recordings. And when she did, they were usually classical repertoire. She was a lieder singer. And lieder singers, and a Bach singer, of course, I mean, a tremendous Bach singer. And lieder singers and concert singers usually have longer lives because they no longer have to quite go, they don't have to exhaust themselves physically and emotionally by acting, or what passes for acting in opera, as well as singing, which I think wears them out a little bit sooner. They can also get by having a smaller voice, because they're usually dealing, especially like Ameling, if you're dealing with Baroque music or lieder, intimate venues and intimate music where the voice doesn't have to work quite so hard to be heard to the audience in general, which is usually a little bit smaller. So yeah, she would have been able probably to preserve herself longer, and she did, but I can't think of a poor record that she made either. Even toward the end of her career, her artistry was absolutely intact, as was her vocal equipment. And that's very important. She's about 87, 88, 89, somewhere in there now. She's still teaching as well, which is wonderful to know. The third was Christa Ludwig, the fabulous mezzo-soprano who I had the great pleasure to know fairly well at a couple of occasions, who was an absolutely delightful person and also an artist of impeccable integrity and standards. I thought she was just terrific. And she had such a beautiful voice. And, she wrote an autobiography, which I think in English was translated as something like In My Own Voice or something. But in German, it was, oh, how I wish I could have been a soprano, because she would have been more of a diva. She would have been more famous. She could have taken on juicier roles. She never liked doing, the mezzo roles, the trouser roles, that she had to dress up as a guy and, all that stuff. And she was rather buxom, and she found it very uncomfortable and restraining. And she was also a brilliant lieder singer, one of the few women who successfully performed Die Winterreise, for example. She worked with all the great conductors of the day. I remember her in her autobiography talking about the three great conductors that she worked with: Karl Böhm, Herbert von Karajan, and Bernstein. And she said that, Böhm and Karajan were very great musicians and great conductors, but Bernstein was a genius, which is an entirely different thing. And I really enjoyed hearing her. One of the last things she did was the old lady in Candide, Bernstein's Candide. And again, she was past her prime then, but she chose a role. She chose a role that would allow her to use her full character and inhabit it perfectly. So you couldn't say that there was anything wrong with her or her voice when she did it. So Christa Ludwig is another artist of impeccable integrity. One of the most curious ones, I think, and interesting ones, was Teresa Stratas. Now, Teresa Stratas, I mean, these people did have careers. Teresa Stratas was around for like 30 years. She was famous, of course, for doing Lulu and the Court and Viol stuff, and also, the videos of Salome and La Traviata. She was one of the great singing actresses of the 20th century, and she walked away from it. She went to work for Mother Teresa in Calcutta. She did all kinds of unusual things to fulfill herself. And, her voice was always tricky. You couldn't ever really say that she was in good shape or not, because she was like Maria Callas. She always gave 110% intensity. And so if she made a raw or ugly sound, it was so inherently part of the characterization that you really couldn't say that her voice was conventionally beautiful to begin with. It was a weapon, is what it was. And that's how she wielded it. And when she decided she'd done what she could and had enough, she simply stopped. And that freaked out a lot of people. She had a famous case that she was fired at the Met, for having, not showing up and canceling things and basically being difficult to deal with. And she sued the Met for her contract, for the remainder of her contract, and she won. And she got paid her settlement, and she donated it to the Met and said, "Screw you." And that was it. That was her career. Really, really an extraordinary person. She's around too. She lives in Florida. I'm not sure what she's doing, but she also knew exactly when it was time to quit. Last but not least, the most famous of all the opera singers. Some of you may not know her well, because she was an early 20th century singer, but the most famous voice ever to walk away was arguably the greatest soprano voice of the entire 20th century that made it to records. And that was Rosa Ponselle, who happily was from Connecticut. Yeah, she was from Waterbury, which is really one scary town, actually, or somewhere around Waterbury. But Rosa Ponselle was, worshipped as possibly the greatest soprano voice that has ever existed. And she started to feel that her voice was going. She wanted to do, lower roles, because she never really had a high C. It was always the note that scared her to death. And she had terrible stage fright. She really did. She was one of the most nervous singers that was ever out there. And so when she couldn't get the role she wanted to do, I think, Adriana Lecouvreur, which is a real second-rate opera that lots of second-rate sopranos like to do, or failing sopranos, because the tessitura is low. And they wouldn't give it to her. The Met wouldn't give it to her. And so she said, bye. And she retired. And she retired to Villa Pace, or whatever it was called, in Baltimore. And she coached and she taught the Baltimore Opera, and she accompanied herself at the piano at home and sang and recorded some of the songs and things that she did. There were recordings made of her home music making, but she never appeared on stage again. She gave up the entire career, and she was at her very, very peak. I mean, she had the entire operatic world at her feet, and she just said, screw it, I'm not interested, which I also think is fascinating. And again, it was definitely a function of artistic integrity, because she knew that her voice she knew what her pluses and strengths and weaknesses were. She knew that the voice only had a limited amount of time left. She wanted, if she was going to be on stage, she was going to show herself at what she thought was her best. And if the rest of the world wouldn't cooperate with her, then to hell with them. So those were the singers who quit in time, who quit for a lot of reasons. Of course, it's more complicated than just, rank idealism. But there was a healthy dose of that, too. There's a great deal of artistic integrity in all 5 of these splendid ladies, no question about it. The situation is different with instrumentalists. First of all, it's much harder to tell when an instrumentalist is failing, and I think the weakness is much more incremental as time goes on. And especially on recordings, you can dub and splice and fake things. So, it's a real question of how, just in what kind of shape the artist is really in. But there are 2, I can really only think of 2, who really got out when it was time to get out, when they were still absolutely in their prime. One was Heifetz. Heifetz quit the moment he felt that his violin playing was going to degenerate, was going below his standards. He didn't give up quite entirely. He always made music at home. He made music with friends. But he quit his concert career at just the right moment, because his reputation was one of the acme of violinistic perfection. And at some point, you become a prisoner of your own myth. And that's what happened to Heifetz. Menuhin always had problems, and so he went on forever. Nobody really expected, everyone knew his intonation was going to be a little, it was okay. You either accepted it or you just dismissed him. Gideon Kramer is another one. His tone was never all that beautiful. So he keeps playing. No one expects him to sound, like Misha Elman, for example. They expect him to sound a little bit edgy and raw, and that's just him. And so he might be deteriorating somewhat. I think he has actually, but people aren't going to call him on it because that's not his calling card. But with Heifetz, it's a real issue. It was a real issue because the moment he dropped below a certain level, the piranha were circling, ready to rip him to pieces. And so he didn't let anyone rip him to pieces. He got out before he could be ripped. And the other artist who quit absolutely at his prime, and this is a fascinating case study, was Liszt. We tend to forget, Liszt was the greatest piano virtuoso of the universe, but he toured for about, 20 years maybe, or something like that, maybe less, all over Europe. He invented the piano recycle. He dragged his Erard piano around with him on, a horse-drawn carriage. And then he simply stopped. He retired. He retired to Weimar. He stopped giving public concerts completely. And he became a composer and a teacher exclusively. And those who heard him play, at least in the early years of his retirement, all were unanimous in saying that his technique was every bit as fine as it had ever been. But he was not interested in continuing to play. He just wanted to do other things. He felt that his calling actually was not as a virtuoso, and having reached that pinnacle, he was content to, teach for free always. He never charged a nickel to teach, and he never took time off because he was sick. He said one does not make allowances for ill health. He would always teach. He was always there. He always had whoever he wanted as his students. And then he composed and he conducted. And in his later years, he just made this pilgrimage from Weimar to Bayreuth to Hungary to Rome. And he would just, every year, he would sort of do the grand tour. It was a triangle, actually. It was Weimar, Rome, Budapest, Weimar, Rome, Budapest. And he would be in residence, but he would not perform publicly for the most part. I don't remember exactly if that was 100%, if he didn't do something for a charity or a benefit or something. But basically, his career as a concert virtuoso was over, and his technique never suffered, was not suffering at the time that he left the stage. But you can tell from how few of these examples there are that it very seldom happens. Very seldom. And of course, in the world of recordings, it's even harder to figure it out because we have the documentation. You can hear these people when they were young and fresh and when they were old and decrepit. Consider Rubinstein, or Horowitz. Horowitz particularly planned his late repertoire along the lines of what he knew he could do. But there was no question he couldn't do what he used to do. Rubinstein he was blind, he missed notes all over the place. We have recordings of multiple Beethoven concerto cycles and Brahms concertos and all this other stuff. We can hear the decline in his technical ability, which was not necessarily accompanied by greater artistic insight. Part of that is due to the fact that a lot of the repertoire that he was playing didn't call for any particular artistic insight. It was all about beauty of tone and shapeliness of phrase, and it wasn't really deep music. And that has to do with the repertoire of the instrument in question. Now, you may have, lists of other artists about whom that's true. But we really need to talk about conductors, because that was the question. That's what got this whole thing started. It is impossible to tell with any certainty when a conductor is tanking unless you have a large body of work that you can make really detailed comparisons about. And even then it's hard to tell. It's actually easier, and this may be a cop-out, to talk about conductors who didn't lose it as they got older because they are much rarer. We all know that conductors deteriorate as they get older. They all do. They get slower or they get faster and more rigid, as Toscanini did in that horrible Haydn Surprise Symphony I talked about a few videos ago. We know that they're going to disintegrate. And it shows in their performances. There's no question about that, but you can't get rid of them. They're like cockroaches. They just keep coming back. It's unbelievable because people will pay to see them, and somehow they live in this bubble that tells them that they're necessary, that the world of art can't get on without them. It's the Furtwängler lie. I stayed with the Nazis and essentially became the poster child of Nazi art because German art needed me. Well, no, it didn't. It didn't at all. And Furtwängler also sort of, disintegrated, and he wasn't told when he died. But there are three conductors who I think remained remarkably consistent, and it's interesting to consider each one in turn, how they did it and what they did. First, Karajan. Karajan was the most amazingly consistent conductor who ever lived in the 20th century. He really was incredible. The reason that he didn't noticeably decline is that he never noticeably improved. If you listen to Karajan's recordings from the 40s and 50s as monos with the Philharmonia all the way until the 80s at the end with Vienna, after he'd already had his fight with the Berlin Philharmonic, there are virtually no significant changes in detail in interpretation of any of that music, and he recorded the same stuff over and over and over again, so it's there for comparison. Yeah, there are a couple where you might find a minute or two, but the basic aesthetic was the same. And so the only way that you could tell that things were going downhill is if something really major happened, and nothing major ever happened with Karajan. He was Karajan. He was absolutely consistent for virtually his entire career. The only difference was his ability to exercise his will over the orchestra to create the kind of sound that he wanted. It was all sonic stuff. Would the strings be that thick and legato, or would he allow a woodwind to pop into the texture once in a while? And when he did, you go, oh, look, it's awfully nice. But it was still him, and the overall shape of the performance, that is the timings and all that stuff, almost never changed. Almost. There were allowances for soloists, for things like that, and especially in the opera, he could be variable depending on who the singers were. But in symphonic repertoire, he was unbelievably consistent. And when he died, he also wasn't that old. He wasn't terribly old, but he was still making some great records in screechy digital sound. But some of them were great. Some of them were horrible. There's no way to know that they would have been great had they been done 20 years earlier. That is, the horrible ones. The other conductor, well, I have three of them here. Another conductor who did not deteriorate with age was Günter Wand. Now, part of the reason he didn't deteriorate is that most people are unfamiliar with his earlier work. So we had no way of telling if he deteriorated because he didn't make a lot of records as a young conductor. There were radio recordings. There were some things on Non-Such, you may recall. He was a very, very serious and consistent conductor also. He pushed himself to be at the top of his game all the time. But the other way he remained at the top of his game was by just limiting his repertoire. At the end, he only performed Bruckner's Ninth, basically. I assume he did other things too, but yeah, basically, right? Every few months there was another Günter von Bruckner recording, and usually it was the Ninth. There were 5, 6 recordings of Bruckner's Ninth. It's almost ridiculous. And he did Brahms and he did Beethoven. He did the German standards. He did Beethoven, Brahms, and Bruckner. That was his whole late career. So if you're going to limit yourself to just that tiny core repertoire, then you're not risking much, especially if you know it really, really well and you insist on getting extra rehearsals for every performance and you get them. If that happens, you can be 150 and you don't have to worry about anything. You're going to get more or less the results that you want. But the fact of the matter is he got those results consistently, time after time after time, which is amazing. However, the one conductor I can think of who who was absolutely operating at 100% till the very end of his life was Stokowski. I mean, he was in his 90s, and his late recordings are thrilling. Some of them are better than his earlier ones. He kept doing unusual repertoire. He kept doing all of this stuff that made Stokowski Stokowski. He had that special sound. He had orchestras playing like demons. How he did it is a mystery. He was a true podium wizard. He was able to get players to do whatever he damn well pleased, even when he was as decrepit and crazy looking as, anything you've ever seen in your life. But he did it. He pulled it out of him. And he didn't slow down at all. Ensemble didn't get looser a bit. He was still just as interested in sonics and engineering and sound as at any point in his career. He was still doing interesting and unusual repertoire to the very, very end. He was a marvel. My goodness, that was phenomenal. A true phenomenon, an extraordinary phenomenon. And there was nobody like him. Absolutely nobody like him. Just about every other conductor I can think of definitely went downhill. And, I really can't think of any conductors who got out. I know there are some who got out of the business for whatever reason, they got out, but not because they felt that their artistic ideals did not permit them to do their best work on every occasion. But Stokowski was the exception that proves the rule, because he did do his best work on just about every occasion, at least as far as he was concerned. I don't know about us, but he certainly showed no sign of old age or frailty. And that was really, really, it's a remarkable thing to consider. And I think he deserves quite a bit of credit, not just for that, but a certain amount of reconsideration, because he has always been looked down on by the snotty, elitist set because of his showmanship and his supposed lack of taste, et cetera, and so forth. But no, he was an unbelievably gifted musical personality. And that, my friends, is the tract, the lecture on who quit when the quitting was good. And I'm very curious to see if you've got some ideas about artists who actually left when they should have left, or other conductors who were fine until the very last day, or artists who were fine until their very last day. It's an interesting question, a very, very interesting question, a very complicated question that allows of no simple answers and no real generalizations. But I've tried to make a couple, and I hope you found them interesting. So keep on listening, my friends, and thank you so much for joining me.